Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, it is my inestimable pleasure to welcome Dr. Dr Kripal, Rice University Professor of Philosophy and Religious Thought, author, speaker, and academic trailblazer. Dr. Kripal, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. I reached out because I absolutely devoured your latest book, The Supernatural. Something of a fanboy. But thinking back to, I guess, how you tend to write in general, you bring a lot of yourself. There's a lot of personality to your books published, which is why I have high hopes for question one. Jeff, were you a weird kid?
Was I a weird kid?
Mm-hmm.
I was not a weird kid, but I was a very weird teenager. Puberty was the break with the normal and the entrance into the weird. So yes. And
you think that was actually a chemical thing, or was there a moment where you go, do you know what? I'm going to be weird. I'm going to go to India and maybe join a seminary and all that.
So I've written about this a lot. So I will now tell you some seemingly intimate things, which are not really intimate because I've written them in my published work. I was a very normal kid. I grew up in a small farming community in Nebraska, which is right in the center of the country. And I grew up in a very happy, kind of healthy family. And I hit puberty and everything went to hell, basically. I quit eating. I became anorexic. I became super, super pious. I began on a quest to become a saint, essentially. I grew up Roman Catholic, so all of this was framed in terms of Catholic asceticism and Catholic sainthood. And I had also been an athlete. I was a very good athlete as a young boy, but when you stop eating, it becomes very difficult to be an athlete. And so it just destroyed everything. It destroyed my athletic career. It destroyed my social life. It destroyed my body. And it set me on this very strange path that was religious in nature at the beginning. My parents were very concerned, and they did what parents do in that situation. They went to people who they thought could help, and one of them happened to be a Benedictine monk who had grown up as a boy with my dad and came back to that little town regularly to see his family. And that monk became, in effect, my spiritual director and my counselor and my therapist all rolled into one, and kind of held me together until I got to the seminary, which had turned out to be the seminary at the monastery where he was a monk. So yes, I was a very weird kid in the sense I was extremely pious and anorexic.
Were your parents particularly pious as well? Did they think they had a St. Geoffrey of Assisi on their hands?
No, Mom and Dad and my family in general were just good, solid kind of cultural Catholics. You sort of like the air you breathe, the water you drink, but not particularly pious in any intense way. So no, I was something of an anomaly for sure, very, very early on.
And you actually write about this in the intro to The Serpent's Gift, I believe, where you talk about it was at seminary that you had an event that sort of got you past the anorexia.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The monks, it was a very sophisticated monastic community, as monastic communities tend to be, and one of the monks there was a trained psychoanalyst, and so they put me into psychoanalysis with this monk analyst, and over the course of about 6 or 7 months, he took me through a very dramatic encounter with my dream life and my repressions, and it ended up curing me of the anorexia. And I could use a little anorexia about now, actually, but
Yeah,
I have
right.
not been anorexic since. So
Oh, well, he did his job too well.
yeah, it
So,
was it was dramatic, Gordon. I don't mean to make fun of it. I mean, what was so amazing about it was, the upshot was that I was not eating as a way to repress my sexuality, which was a way to essentially not grow up, kind of stop life, stop time by stop eating and stopping the maturation of the body. Very naive, stupid logic, but that was in fact the logic deep down. And what was so astonishing to me about not eating for 6 or 7 years and then suddenly being able to eat was the realization that my religious behavior had been driven by forces that were entirely offline, entirely unconscious. And I was just so amazed by that. And that my religious behavior and religious beliefs, which were entirely sincere, could also be deadly and dysfunctional and profoundly bad. Um, so those were really hard lessons. I essentially learned not to believe my own beliefs and to be suspicious about my own religious behaviors. That was a tough lesson,
was
but
that when the religion professor was born, do you think?
I think so. I think so. I think that those were the first real life lessons that uh, religion is not what it appears to be, and human beings are far more complex and lead a far richer spiritual and psychological life than we imagine. Um, and what's interesting about it was, it was not just that religion's bad and religious behaviors are about sexual repression. That wasn't the takeaway. It happened to be true in my case, but I was aware it wasn't true in other cases. And remember, I realized all of this in the context of a very healthy, very sophisticated religious community that was pushing me to realize all of this psychological stuff. So it wasn't a simple, either or kind of situation. It was a very rich, multi-layered psychological awakening for me.
And presumably, I mean, obviously I agree wholeheartedly with it not being an either or. It's a fairly dramatic way to realize or act out the notion that religion is a hugely powerful and hugely complex thing, and even if you think you've got it right, it's got something else going on if you're not particularly careful with it. And I imagine it becomes a very compelling thing to actually continue to study when you think there is something to this, and it is more than what is presented as an either or.
Right. And of course, once you learn to be suspicious of your own motivations and your own religious impulses, it's only natural and reasonable to become suspicious of other people's. But, if you begin with yourself, then you tend to have a lot more compassion and have a lot more insight into, I think, other people's impulses and behaviors. You learn it first with yourself, and then you apply it to others. I often tell my graduate students that they have no business being a scholar of religion until they've lost at least two worlds. And I really believe that, actually. Because if you just lose one world, you can still be under the illusion that you can just adopt a second and that will somehow solve everything. But once you've lost two worlds, you begin to understand that a world's just a world, and there's always another world, and the worlds are infinite, as it were, and that the answers are not going to come by just jumping into another cultural world or another belief system. They're going to have to be found some other way.
Did you realize that at seminary with the loss of the first world? Did you say, I'm going to go find another one?
No, I didn't. No, because after the seminary, I had only lost one world. The next world I adopted was a kind of Hindu tantric world that I took up in graduate school and imagined and lived out and meditated on for about a decade and a half. But then I lost that world too through a whole nother series of events. So that for me was the second world that I lost.
And it came with some, as we move on to talking about the books, it came with some impressive supernatural, with a space between the words, events. The Shaktipat experience in India that you describe in the book, for instance.
Right. I when I was living in India in 1989-90, I was living in Calcutta actually, and studying Shakta Tantra there, and in particular a set of texts about the life and teachings of Ramakrishna. And during Kali Puja of 1989, I had a very dramatic kind of Shaktipat experience while I was sleeping one night. Essentially woke up asleep, couldn't move. It was kind of a classic sleep paralysis event, but it had, clear kind of noetic or gnostic undercurrents to it. The energy that was engaging me was clearly conscious. It somehow knew what it was doing, and it eventually resulted in an out-of-body experience and a kind of downloading, as I would describe it much later. And that was the sort of the origin point, really, of my first book, Kali's Child, and really, in some sense, all the books are kind of stuttering attempts to communicate, I think, something that was essentially given to me in that night, as I call it.
So, that's a great jumping off point to several of the books, but we might want to work reverse chronologically back for a bit. You describe it in The Supernatural, which is a wonderful book. I have been pimping it on the show and telling everyone to read it. I press it into their hands, but I bought the Kindle version, so that will get quite expensive for me. But why settle on the title The Supernatural?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the key idea, isn't it, of the whole book? The notion of the book, or the idea of the book, is that the traditional sense of the supernatural implies some kind of dualism, where the divine is outside the natural order, and the kinds of experiences that Whitley Strieber had seem to contradict that. If you read Whitley carefully and closely, his encounters with what he calls the visitors are very much a part of the natural world. They're often very physical in nature. He even suggests that the soul is somehow a plasma, or is electromagnetic in nature in some way. So he very much wants to argue that what he's experienced is certainly extraordinary, but it remains a part of the world that we actually live in. It's real. It's physical. And I had used this phrase, the supernatural, 3 words, in a textbook I had written called Comparing Religions, to describe what I think is the worldview of a lot of indigenous or primal cultures that do not experience the sacred as somehow apart from the natural world, but the sacred is experienced through the natural world. There's no division. In the old days, we used to call this animism. Today we call it panpsychism or panentheism or something.
Well, we're animists around here. I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Kastrup. I have similar problems with the word panpsychism that he does, which is, I think, it's the last refuge of the materialists.
I know Bernardo's I know Bernardo's argument well, and I think it's essentially correct. But that was the old language.
Yes.
And so the supernatural is an attempt to sort of give it a new language that is more contemporary and in some ways simpler. But it also functions as a kind of koan or riddle, with that little space there. What is the relationship? I mean, we kind of leave the door open. We're not trying to reduce the supernatural to just some kind of materialism, but we clearly don't want to suggest in the book either that it's the same old, same old. We're trying to push the conversation essentially into a new kind of nuance or subtlety.
Well, I certainly think that's necessary, because you have, on one side, the materialists hiding in panpsychism, and on the other side you have, particularly talking about Whitley, who we'll come on to in a sec, but you have everyone abandoning, over the last 10 years, ufologists have abandoned the extraterrestrial hypothesis boat for the consciousness hypothesis boat, which is fine. We can be in broad agreement about that. However, the word doesn't mean what they think it means, because the phenomena presents in a very physical way very often, and
Yep.
and the parts of it that aren't, Cold War skullduggery, the parts that do present in a physical way have a typological similarity to cultural experiences around the world going back as far as we can see.
I think so. I think that's right, and that's my function in the book. The supernatural is to essentially contextualize Whitley's experiences in this much, much broader history of religions perspective.
Which you do amazingly. It's a really brave book, frankly, because you're just sort of going, right, okay, here are actual data. What next? I mean, I think there are sort of corners of the discourse that squirm when you show them stuff that actually needs to be addressed, because it's probably quite important in kind of conceptualizing on a wider level potentially what's going on.
Yeah. As I'm at the end of the day, I'm a professor, and so I'm always wanting to teach. And the main strategy of the book for me is that it really all comes down to how we compare. And when people talk about the UFO phenomenon, their comparative strategies tend to be very simplistic and very distorting. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is say, no, this is how you compare these things. This is what you put on the table, and this looks like this, and that looks like that, and this is how you do that. And that sounds abstract, but if you start talking to anyone about the UFO phenomenon, they'll immediately begin comparing it to something, and they'll often do it in a very naive way that ends up actually, I think, scrambling the question instead of clarifying it. And so that's very much what the book is about, is what to put on the table to compare, and what all of those things on the table tell us about the questions that we have.
The comparison itself is, I know, and I studied it, so I'm in broad agreement. I know you're not a huge fan of kind of neocolonialism and those sort of ways of seeing the world, because more often than not they're done, again, in a very naive way. There's probably something good in the background of it. But comparison, or comparing across things, got quite bloodied, and in the fight with the rise of post-structuralism and all these kind of ideas. And even in that, it's there's almost a political act in going, no, we should compare things, and here's how we do that.
Right. So comparison, as you've just noted, comparison in the academy has been on the defensive for about 30, 40 years now. And the bottom line there was essentially comparison is bad. And the reason it's bad is because, or so the argument goes, is that in the past people have compared religions, for example, in a colonial or imperial context in a way that always served the colonial or imperial interest. So, you say, well, India is spiritual and the West is material, and that kind of sounds like a compliment, but really the spiritual is always framed as feminine and the material is always framed as masculine. So it's asserting this kind of dominance of Europe over the rest of the world. That's essentially the argument.
And they view it as the first step to, like, the next thing you're going to say is some sort of, diffusionist Aryan.
Right, which is a comparative strategy as well. The problem is, of course, just because we can point out what a bad comparison looks like doesn't mean people stop comparing. They just keep on comparing. And so if intellectuals and professors stop talking about comparison, people are just going to keep doing it, and they're going to be doing it in these ways that are problematic. And so my argument for a decade or so has been, no, we have to bring back comparison, and we have to be sensitive to these critiques, which are essentially all correct. But bad instances, a bad use of an idea doesn't mean the idea is bad. It just means it was badly used. And there are very powerful ways of comparing things. I mean, essentially Darwinian biology is pure comparison. Pretty much anything human beings do relies on some comparative act. So, including the UFO phenomenon, I mean, the ancient astronaut people are doing comparison.
Well, that's an extremely good example of that sort of naive use of comparison, because you are on the ETH side or the debunking side, you'll end up with people comparing it to combustion physics on Earth, and then on the ancient alien side, the comparison happens with some highly speculative ideas from some popular books 40 years ago. And I mean, my book just showed up there, so I kind of go into this. That's sort of its wheelhouse. But there is definitely a better way of phenomenologically examining what's being spoken about here.
Yeah, I mean, the two examples I use in the introduction of the book is, I talk about the ancient astronaut comparativists, and basically what they're doing is they're assuming the worldview of the present with all of our technology and science, and then they're reading that back into the past and essentially saying there's no such thing as magic, or there's no such thing as a miracle or an anomalous event. It's just people misperceiving technology, essentially. But of course, that's a very ethnocentric, but kind of very myopic view of things. You're just assuming the truth of our own present. And evangelical Christians do the opposite. They assume the truth of the ancient biblical world, and where these sorts of things would be framed as demons. And so they read that into the present. They read from the past to the present, and the ancient alien folks read from the present to the past. And they're both assuming things. And what we try to do in the book is certainly listen to those two strategies when they give us something, but not adopt either one in any kind of dogmatic way.
So you sort of mentioned in the book that you've known Whitley for a while. Whose idea was the book?
Well, I don't know. I think what happened was we had talked about doing something for quite a while, and I think I had proposed trying to write a novel together, which was clearly a very bad idea because I've never written a novel. And I think Whitley very kindly and gently nudged the proposal to something along, a nonfiction book, and so we just started to exchange chapters essentially. It took us about 6 or 7 months to really get the book not finished, but mapped out, and maybe another 6 or 7 months to polish it.
Yeah, it's the chapter back and forward thing has a really nice rhythm to it. It's especially as you read your stuff, you're like, oh, okay, I'll file that away, and then you read a Whitley chapter, and the pieces start to make sense. I was very fascinated by. I mean, I didn't realize after his 1985 event that he went and asked other people in the sort of Hudson Valley area if any other things had been going on, and some of the supernatural events that people describe to him look a lot more like spirits from the grimoires, with sort of men in black turning into birds of paradise and vanishing. And then if you read sort of further back, I don't know if you've read, you probably would have, Mitch Horowitz's Occult America, and he has this wonderful thing about the burned over district, and that whole upstate New York has been very odd for a while.
Well, Gordon, a new book just came out on that by oh shoot, I'm drawing a total blank. It's called Upstate Cauldron, and it's just wonderful. I'm just having one of those moments. Jocelyn Godwin, of course.
Oh,
I don't
cool.
know if you're from.
Oh, yes,
yeah, Jocelyn just came out. It was maybe last fall or last summer. It's called Upstate Cauldron, and it's on the burned over district. But of course, he frames it in a more magical metaphor there, and that's what I point out in this book, is that actually there's a long historical context here for this part of the world and these sorts of events. So
I loved it. It was it's like reading more Jacques Vallée. I think that sort of way of kind of combining a very sober analysis of supernatural or extra-dimensional, even that's going too far, events in that longer context, and sort of looking sideways at it. It's an excellent thing.
Yeah, it normalizes it in some way. I mean, we don't want to make it too normal, because I think the whole point of it is not to be normal, but it does naturalize it in some way, and it makes it part of our world, and helps us to talk about it in a way that doesn't turn people off.
So one of the things, I mean, it's sort of early on in the book, but I thought it was quite good. As a backstory, a previous iteration of my blog had the tagline, Chaos Magic, Phenomenology, Stringent Opinions, choose two. And your description of phenomenology, which I think is the missing piece if you want to do less naive comparison in this space, was just excellent. So for the listeners, what is the Dr. Kripal description of phenomenology? You don't have to read from the book. This is just a test.
Well, the phrase is simply making the cut. To draw a distinction between what someone sees or experiences, which is the phenomenon, and what's actually there or not there, depending on the case, the noumenon or the real itself. So that's what I call making the cut in the book, and it's essentially the most basic method of phenomenology is simply to focus on what appears to a particular subject or psyche, and to detail it in great nuance and detail, but not to worry, at least up front, about what the ultimate object or source of the appearance or the phenomenon is. You can go on and do that later, but phenomenology is about bracketing that question of the source or ultimate nature of what one's seeing or experiencing, and just focusing on the experience itself. So once we make that cut and focus on the experience and not the question of where it's coming from, we can be a lot more generous and a lot more capacious about embracing people's strange experiences, because they simply are what they are. They're appearances, they're experiences, and they may or may not point to something else. I mean, I happen to think they often do, but the point is that we can focus on the experience and not get all twisted up about the ultimate object or source of it. The metaphor I give is it's like walking into a movie theater. You suspend your judgment about what is real, and you enjoy the movie for what it is, a movie. And then afterwards you put the bracket back on and you exit the theater. And that's a very good metaphor for studying other people's religious experiences. You need to bracket your own worldview, your own assumptions, enter their experience, enter their movie, and then exit.
Well, actually, you touch on something there which you've mentioned in a couple of books. The idea that perhaps people shouldn't be studying religion or other people's religions in particular without either an openness to a supernatural experience or actually having had them, because it becomes much more challenging. I think if people don't do that, they haven't lost their two worlds yet. They may have lost the first one, but they haven't lost the second, which is the assumed or adopted materialist kind of academic way of seeing things.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of phenomenology or entering other people's worldviews is that, of course, you enter and exit a world all the time, and so you practice letting go of worlds, and you practice imaginatively entering them, and so you can appreciate any world, but you don't absolutize or believe any particular worldview. The challenge for academics or intellectuals is that they get very good at that, but deep down they've assumed, or often have assumed, some kind of materialist paradigm or worldview. And so every religious experience for them is, at the end of the day, essentially a hallucination or a subjective illusion. And that's clearly a failure to bracket, to put one's assumptions aside. I mean, those can be your conclusions at the end of the day, but I think they're problematic when we assume them trying to understand other people's religious worlds or religious experiences.
Can they really be their conclusions? I mean, you know what I mean. In an individual, in an isolated case, they can be, but I still have some macro challenges with essentially dealing with, particularly with something like Egyptology. People have an expertise in something they don't believe exists, like on any level, and and that seems quite odd. That seems odd that you could spend a career doing that.
Yeah, well, people do.
Yeah, that's true.
Trust me, Gordon. People do. So what's the question? I'm sorry, I'm laughing.
Well, that was just a follow-up to your point. My point was, I still think, in an ideal world, I suppose, someone in academia who's studying these things, be it Egyptology, be it religion, what have you, funnily enough, you get them one-on-one, and they are much more open to some underlying reality behind the cut. But there does still appear to be that kind of monolithic cultural assumption of materialism when they're operating in a professional space, which I find quite frustrating. But whilst writing my book, if you corner an Egyptologist in a pub or in the room, and don't let her leave, right. You can kind of get them to go, I know, but this is how we discuss these things. And I think that is why I found your book quite brave, because you're like, actually, there are other ways to discuss these things.
Yeah, okay, so I think that's correct. So my second book, Roads of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, is about the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism. And essentially what I argue in that book is what you just said, that if you really corner or give enough beers to a particular intellectual or particularly scholar of mysticism, what you'll eventually discover is that the reason they studied the subject is they had some series of mystical events in their lives, and they're using the scholarship as a way of trying to understand that in a kind of indirect way. There's essentially closeted mystics. But the reigning lingua franca of any academic discussion of these things is some kind of social scientific materialism. In other words, everything ends up getting reduced to some kind of social fact or some kind of material base. And the reason is pretty simple. It's not that people are somehow sinister or evil or bad. It's that we can all share an experience of the material world, and it's fairly consistent. And people can get in a room and talk about the material body or sexuality or society, and we all have similar experiences of those physical realities, and so we can have a conversation about those things. So any kind of conversation leads towards a kind of materialist base, where when we're talking about, paranormal events or strange religious experiences, most people in the room will have never had one, at least like that, and so there's really no way to kind of link into it. So I think it's just a natural function of social communication, why that happens. But I agree with you. I mean, this has been my experience over and over. I lecture all over the country and Europe on the paranormal, and I'm very upfront about what I think, and I talk about my own experiences occasionally. And inevitably, what happens after a public lecture is some colleague is taking me back to the hotel or taking me to dinner or something, and he or she will say, "Can I tell you a story?" And then, out comes this amazing drop your jaw story about some event in their life, which they would have never told you, had you not just spent an hour and a half talking about the paranormal.
Doesn't that suggest that when you said that only a minority of people in the room would have these things, I think the opposite. I think the majority of people have even something as fairly pedestrian as telephone telepathy. I think there's an opportunity. I mean, it's very utopian and it won't happen, but I think there's an opportunity to, as you say, bring to the table things to be compared. And one of them is, well, these phenomena have been observed in laboratory settings for 120 years. So let's stop pretending that this is an episode of Scooby-Doo. Let's actually say these are possibilities for comparison. These are things that could happen. I mean, the drunk who saw the flying saucer may have just hallucinated from rum, but there are other options.
Right. Yeah. When I agree with you, Gordon. I think a good share of people in any particular audience will have had such an experience. But what I was referring to is, the visionary details of the experience are often very unique, and are not often common across multiple people. And of course, we also have to remember that when Gordon or Jeff go give a lecture on Star.Ships or the paranormal, the people who come to that are not, they're self-selecting, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
They're not an even slice of society, and they're sure not, an even slice of the American Scientific Society or something. So I think I do really want to honor the fact that a lot of perfectly sincere human beings have absolutely no experience of these things, and they're just being honest when they say, I don't believe it, or I don't think that can happen.
That's great. I wouldn't. I mean, it's on balance volume for the planet Earth. It's a minority because we're still dealing in a world where the majority of people have some frame of reference for. Even the non-physical doesn't work now, but the supernatural with a space in between. So I get that. I guess my persistent frustration is the assumption that is the default or the template worldview. Certainly people are allowed to, you want to be a materialist, you haven't had an experience with these things, that's fine. That's not the home ground. That's not where we come back to. That's not the Atlanta airport where we sort of return to before going off and assuming other worldviews. There is no hub airport, I think, is where I'm going with this hastily assembled
Yeah.
metaphor.
Right. Right. Because of course the danger there is that if we just assume the materialist base, that's going to be the inertia of any conversation or any new imagining that we might try to engage in.
Yeah, which again, coming back to your brave book, I want to touch on your I won't let you name names. People will be mortified, but that realization that led to the book that a lot of scholars of religion and philosophy are closet mystics. That kind of lines up quite well with, say, Authors of the Impossible, which is not only you know what, I like the supernatural better, but it's a photo finish. I adore that book. I keep going back to it. I'm a little bit jealous you got to write it, but you know, you're the one who has the career in academia. That's fine. I'm just the podcaster. But
That's not true, Gordon.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I loved it. It's a remarkable book, but it was very interesting to see that similar comparison thing at work, which is, let's look at some of the luminaries from essentially the history of paranormal studies, and there does appear to be there are some events in the lives that invite comparison. So you know, Dr. Vallée having you know, the classic light in the sky experience as a kid growing up in regional France, and everyone having something that they're like, oh, that's odd.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, of course, that's how, you know, traditionally the shaman is called too. There's some anomalous experience. The point I was trying to make in Authors of the, well, there are lots of points, but the main point was that I think, I mean, I admire parapsychology and have lots of friends in the field, but I don't think that science and the scientific method are always the best way to get at what a paranormal event is really about. And if we get caught in this sort of logic of proof or disproof or cause and mechanism, we miss entirely what these events appear to be trying to say, which is they're trying to say something. In other words, it's about language, it's about meaning, it's about some story that's trying to emerge. It's about writing and reading. That's why it's called Authors of the Impossible. But there's something about many paranormal events, not all, but many, that are fundamentally related to human communication and the ability to reimagine ourselves through a new story. And so I talk about all these. We talk about psychical readings, for example, and we never really think about what that means. Or so many paranormal events are really about some word that appears, or some text, or someone hears a voice. You know, it's all this language is just strewn right through all of this. So there's this magical notion of language that I think we've lost, and I wanted to get back to that and basically say, look, you know, the humanities, the study of literature, the study of religion, the study of myth has something really to say about the paranormal. It's just not about laboratories and statistics and, you know, crunching numbers. That was sort of the big point of the book.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I agree, but, no, not but. So if you were king of parapsychology, because, I mean, yeah, how many times do we need, we've done 120 years of, you know, getting slightly above chance results for telepathy or what have you. What is the piece that combines the two? Because it seems to me that, I guess, comes back to the materialist challenge to start with, which is sort of trying to voice an authenticity with a language that isn't set up to fully describe what's going on, or not that any language is, but to better describe what's going on. So what do we do to, elevate parapsychology? Can it be elevated?
Well, yeah. it depends on what our goals are here. I mean, one of the problems with parapsychology is they've never had the resources they need. The millions of dollars are spent on just watching rats go through mazes. I mean, none of that's ever been spent on parapsychology. I mean, that field has struggled for, lots of studies, but it's basically struggled with pennies and dimes for 120 years. And if we actually gave, as a culture now, the resources and invested in that kind of thing, I think we would come to some kind of set of conclusions. But they wouldn't provide the kind of robust phenomena that we see in real life, around death, for example, or illness, or accident, or tragedy. I think the bottom line is that strange things happen for a reason in real life, and if you want to make them go away, what you do is you set up a laboratory and you try to operationalize them, and then they go away. Because that's not what they're about. That's not what they're for. So I think that's the deeper insight, is that these things are fundamentally about life and human connectedness, and the very measures that the scientific method needs to take to set up an experiment are the very things that make them disappear, because they're not about that. I think that's the irony of the situation.
It is, in a utopian sense. I guess I come back to the example would be sort of Upstate Cauldron, which I haven't read, but I'm now going to, rather than the Burned Over District, because that's just one part of it, and I'm sure I have a bunch of New York friends, and someone will mention that. If you look at the sequence of events from, Shakers to spiritualists to various wandering mesmerists and so on, it was almost like building a pyramid. Like it was this sort of ritual, accidental ritual space that made. I'm operating under the assumption that you make a space for spirits. You start to get more spirits. Once you get more spirits, you realize the spirit thing is probably quite important, and you end up with a ballooning of phenomena which continues up until 1985, and it is a regular UFO hotspot, which I find interesting because it's the place where people started prophesying that the spirits will come here and all this kind of thing. So getting back to parapsychology, with an unlimited amount of money, I think at some point, and some very, very dubious ethics, I think at some point, if you were king of parapsychology, you would be able to draw the line under whether consciousness exists beyond death. I think you'd be able to go, do you know what? Based on a meta-analysis of all these reports, based on some really dodgy flatlining stuff we've been doing to people and making the space for them to have these discussions, we can, using quote-unquote science, say that happens. And I think you would trigger a similar ritual effect where once you open that crack a little bit, then more impressive effects start to happen. And this is kind of my point behind not ceding the default position to materialists within academia, because if you make a space for people to say there is something to all this, then all this will start happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. You're essentially talking about a kind of conjuring.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I just think that's right. Again, that's why I called the book Authors of the Impossible. I wasn't just talking about 4 authors of the impossible. I was trying to authorize the impossible. I was trying to create a space for talking about it that other people could then jump into and take it in different directions. I think that's what we do when we speak about it like this. We authorize it for others, and then others speak their own truths and their own experiences, and that's how a culture, grows and changes.
Which is why I think it's it's kind of a sister book to the supernatural, because what is Whitley but that?
Yeah. No, he is.
Yeah, making the space to go. Yeah, he and Anne for decades, going, there is something to all this. This is my stuff. This is what I found, and that's why I find the book, you know, bless all who sail in her, because I think it's quite important, and I think it's going to be much like Authors of the Impossible, this sort of depth charge that eventually things will start to float to the surface.
Well, Gordon, you're so kind. I so appreciate that. You know, when you write books, you know this too. It sort of feels like you're throwing a Kleenex off the Grand Canyon. You just
you just
absolutely just nothing. You just nothing,
yeah.
And then there's something, and people echo back, and it's very heartening, very very satisfying. Because of course, at the end of the day, the reason someone writes a book is to communicate with other human beings and to have a conversation, whether that's in person or in between the lines of the reading.
Well, yeah, and I think for the people who listen to this show, who are sort of in the business of trying to get paranormal events to go their way, it's fascinating to broaden out the scope, because I mean I've ragged on academics and I've ragged on ufologists, but the occult world is just as bad, if not worse, when it comes to comparison, because if it doesn't, people come to it like they come to religion, very broken, and so they haven't lost their two worlds yet. The occult is very likely their second world, or magic, but they haven't lost it. So it's been a wild ride these last few years to kind of elevate some of the, say, Whitley Strieber style stuff, or things from ufology, to say these things need to be looked together. They may not be the same, they probably aren't, but we're looking at a spectrum, a phenomenological spectrum, and that runs the risk of breaking their second world, which I would like to do, because I think that's a great metaphor that I will steal. People need to have two worlds destroyed.
Please do.
Yeah.
Well, I think, because I think it gets at something. I think it gets at something really important. You know, there's something, we call that reflexivity in the study of religion, where you're always aware of your awareness. You're always thinking about your thinking, and when you do that, it becomes very difficult to align yourself with any particular culture or worldview. And that's not easy. That's not entirely a good thing. Because it can also come with loneliness and a kind of a lack of community. But I do think it's also a form of humble transcendence. So.
Oh, I like that. God, Jeff, I'm going to be stealing so much. That's brilliant. I like it. I think for me, let me back that up. You go through a very worthwhile and really concise sort of description of Rudolf Otto's concept of the numinous, which I think is hugely important. And funnily enough, occultists should probably have a better understanding of this than they do, because the experience of the sacred, so for something to be holy doesn't mean it has to be nice. And this is, I think, the other sort of cornerstone of how we begin to bring things to the table and have these discussions.
Right. Do you want me to talk about
the numinous, please? Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is Religious Studies 101. I mean, the common assumption on the street is to be holy is to be good, is to be moral, and religion is about morality, it's about ethics. And religion is partly about ethics and morality. There's always a moral component, but if you look at the origins of any religion, it's seldom simply moral or ethical. It's almost always about an encounter with some force or some energy or presence in the environment that is at once extremely attractive, but also terrifying. And that's what Otto called the numinous. It had this double quality. There was a kind of left-handed sacrality to it that could kill you at any moment, and there was a kind of right-handed sacrality to it that could redeem or liberate you. And I think once we reframe religion, or in this case occultism, around that richer and deeper historical notion of the numinous, then suddenly a lot of things make a great deal of sense that didn't make any sense before. And it also explains why, historically cultures have treated the sacred very carefully. You don't walk up and hug the sacred. You build a temple or a ritual space around it to protect the human community from it, but also to give the community some access to it. It's sort of like a nuclear reactor, It's there and you want its power, but you don't want to get too close to it because it'll annihilate you.
Yeah.
And
there's a reason the witch lives on the edge of town. She's radioactive.
yeah. And I think if you listen to someone like Whitley and his experiences with the visitors, that's exactly what you see. You see pure terror, and you see bliss and love and revelation. You see everything. You see both sides of the sacred. And once we understand the sacred that way, then again we can be much more generous and much more capacious with each other's experiences, whether they're occult or magical or religious. And we can get out of this horrible practice of, calling each other's gods or beliefs demonic. Or we can see the demon as a sacred figure, as a kind of expression of the left-handed sacred, as it were. So I just think that's much richer and much more helpful and more accurate, frankly.
Yeah, I agree with that. So for people who you're probably singing a lot of people's tune right now, where would they go to find this? Is there a good intro book to Rudolf Otto? I mean, we're talking about stuff.
Oh yeah, no. Rudolf Otto's classic book is simply called "The Idea of the Holy," which is is the classic book that everybody in the study of religion has to read. It was published in 1917, and it's fairly small, and it really hasn't been surpassed since. It's as important as William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, which is another kind of classic text in the field, which came out in 1902. But yeah, just go read The Idea of the Holy. And it's a terrible title. Don't be put off by the title.
No, well,
it's called Das Heilig in German. If you want another title, it's Das Heilig, the sacred.
Do you have UFO book recommendations? I mean, was there much research? This book seems almost like a performance piece, but you've certainly demonstrated an extreme depth of knowledge of the subject through previous books. Do you have a UFO book recommendation? Why not?
Oh boy. Well, I'm a big fan of Jacques Vallée's books, as you know. I've been just dipping into Eric Willay. Do you know his stuff on parasociology?
Did he have a
He wrote a book called
recently?
Illumination.
Yes,
Illumination.
no, I've got that downstairs. I've heard a couple of interviews with him.
Eric, again, I'm just trying to dip into his work, but as far as I can tell, he's trying to dip into kind of the social dimensions of the paranormal and how it's better to think of these things as social phenomena, not just subjective or personal ones. One of my other favorite books is it's called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George Hansen.
Yes, top book.
Which I just think is brilliant.
Well, that almost, in a funny way, goes alongside sort of looking at an understanding of the numinous, because not only can God irradiate you or turn you into a pillar of salt, the encounter with the supernatural is, tricksterish and often, as Dr. Vallée would point out, often highly manipulative. Or potentially highly manipulative because they lie, which is fascinating.
Yeah. That's the left-handed side of the sacred again. Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. I have, fanboyed enough, I think, of your books. I don't want to take up.
Oh well, listen, it's mutual. As I said to you before the show, your book Star.Ships arrived literally about 2 hours before this phone call, and so it looks amazing. I'm looking forward to dipping in quickly.
Well, no, You're very welcome. I'm glad the Starship landed just in time. Uh, but no, and I mean, other than the supernatural, do you have a page if people want to say, okay, I'm really into this now because we've discussed Serpent's Gift, Authors of the Impossible,
Yeah.
supernatural? For people who are maybe more of an occult bent, what's like the intro to Dr. Kripal's?
Well, again, I'm not here to self promote, but I guess I am. It's just kripal.rice.edu, and all of my books are summarized there, as are a number of other projects involving film and teaching and lectures. The whole. There's also a number of media pieces that you can hyperlink to, including, I'm sure, soon this piece. So it's all there, kripal.rice.edu.
Nice one. That will definitely be in the show notes. And I've mentioned the supernatural enough on the blog, and I will continue to do so. It's an amazing book. You and Whitley should be congratulated. It's a Kindle version, so it didn't turn any pages, but it's an absolute page turner. It's great stuff.
Well, great. I really, again, thank you, Gordon. I that means a lot to me because you know.
You're very welcome. So, regular listeners may have picked up on Dr. Kripal's animism comment toward the midpoint of the interview. Throw in phenomenology, and it's little wonder I am so bullish about the supernatural. I've said this before, but the wizards and shamans of previous ages would have stepped over their own mothers to get access to the sort of academic and sci research we have available to us now. We really owe it to ourselves to engage with it. And it wasn't just animism and phenomenology. We talked materialism in the academy, challenges in parapsychology, the origins of the term numinous, as well as how it is experienced. So I'm looking forward to seeing your responses. Drop me a note at runesoup.com or on the Facebook page or on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. And if this seems like your jam, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, or on YouTube. Until next time.